The auction hall smelled of old coffee and damp paper, the kind of place where desperation gathered quietly and waited for its name to be called. Sarah Mitchell sat near the back, her daughter's hand-drawn picture folded carefully in her jacket pocket, a reminder of why she was here at all. The metal folding chair beneath her creaked whenever she shifted her weight, and she had learned to sit very still. Around her, men in work boots and stained coveralls studied photocopied sheets with the practiced eyes of people who knew value when they saw it. They spoke in low voices about tonnage and salvage rights, about metal prices and the cost of cutting torches. She understood almost none of it. The morning had started the way most mornings did now, with Emma asking if they could have pancakes, and Sarah explaining again that cereal was fine, that pancakes were for special days. Emma was 7 and still believed her mother when she said things would get better soon. Sarah was 32 and had stopped believing that months ago, somewhere between the second eviction notice and the night she'd sold her wedding ring to buy Emma's asthma medication. The ring had been worth more than she'd gotten for it, but the pawnshop owner had known she had no choice, and desperate people rarely negotiated well. The bankruptcy had been finalized 6 weeks earlier, a quiet ending to what had once been a stable life. Her ex-husband had left 2 years before that, taking the savings account and the truck, leaving behind a daughter who still asked when Daddy was coming home, and debts that Sarah had foolishly co-signed when she still believed in promises. The accounting job had followed him out the door, a casualty of showing up exhausted too many times, of missing work when Emma was sick, of being unable to focus when the numbers on the screen blurred into lists of things she could no longer afford. She had tried. She had worked 3 part-time jobs simultaneously, cleaning offices at dawn, answering phones during the day, stocking shelves at a grocery store until midnight. But part-time work came with no benefits, no security, and no path forward. It only delayed the inevitable. The apartment went first, then the storage unit when she couldn't make the payments. Now everything she owned fit into the back of a borrowed car, and she was sitting in an auction hall on a Saturday morning because a friend of a friend had mentioned that sometimes desperate people found opportunities in desperate places. The auctioneer's voice carried across the room with the practiced rhythm of someone who had done this too many times to care about the human weight of what he sold. He moved through the lots with mechanical efficiency, a pallet of water-damaged lumber, a container of rusted tools, a lot of marine equipment so corroded it looked like it had been dredged from the ocean floor. She watched bidders raise their numbers briefly, competently, men who knew exactly what they wanted and what they could afford to pay. Then, Lot 47 appeared on the screen behind the auctioneer, and the room shifted. A few people laughed. Others shook their heads and returned to their coffee. The image showed a vessel half submerged in murky harbor water, listing so badly to one side that its deck was nearly vertical. The freighter was small by commercial standards, perhaps 200 feet long, its hull streaked with rust and decay. Sections of railing had collapsed. The bridge windows were shattered. Algae darkened the waterline in thick, uneven bands. It looked less like a ship and more like a carcass, something the sea had chewed on and decided to spit back out. "Lot 47, the auctioneer said, his tone flattening slightly. Decommissioned cargo freighter, approximately 60 meters in length, located in the northwest section of Harbor Basin. Sold as is, where is. Buyer responsible for all salvage, removal, and environmental compliance. No warranties expressed or implied. Vessel is partially submerged and deemed structurally unsound. Opening bid set at $500. Silence followed. Not the brief pause of people considering, but the complete absence of interest. Sarah watched the auctioneer scan the room, his expression unchanging. He repeated the terms, his voice carrying the subtle edge of someone who expected nothing. $500. Do I have 500? No one moved. A man near the front muttered something to his neighbor, and they both chuckled quietly. The auctioneer waited the required interval, then prepared to move on. Sarah raised her hand. The movement was small, almost involuntary, but the auctioneer saw it immediately. His eyes locked onto her, and for a moment, something that might have been surprise crossed his face. 500 to bidder 63. A few heads turned. She felt their eyes on her, assessing, dismissing. One man leaned toward his companion and whispered something that made them both smile. She kept her hand steady, her face neutral, the way she had learned to do when bill collectors called or when social workers asked questions. She couldn't answer honestly without losing everything. "Do I have 600?" the auctioneer asked, scanning the room without much hope. No response. The silence stretched longer this time, uncomfortable now. Sarah's heart pounded steadily, a heavy rhythm that seemed too loud for the quiet room. She had $340 in her checking account. She had another $200 in cash, money she'd been saving for a security deposit on a new apartment, and on a place where Emma could have her own room again, where they wouldn't sleep on an air mattress in someone else's garage. "Going once at 500, the auctioneer continued, following protocol. "Going twice." She raised her hand again. 700, she said, her voice carrying more clearly than she expected. This time, the turning heads came with audible reactions. Someone laughed, not cruelly, but with the genuine surprise of witnessing something absurd. Another man shook his head slowly, the way you might at someone about to make a terrible mistake. The auctioneer paused, studying her. "Bidder 63 offers $700. Do I have 8? The room remained silent. Whatever value anyone might have seen in the wreck had been erased by her willingness to pay for it. If someone was fool enough to want it, and it wasn't worth having. "Going once at 700, going twice." The gavel came down with a sharp crack. "Sold to bidder 63 for $700. Sarah signed the papers 30 minutes later, her hand trembling slightly as she wrote her name on documents she barely understood. The clerk processed the payment with professional detachment, counting her cash and running her debit card for the remainder. When the transaction cleared, he handed her a receipt and a thick folder containing survey documents, previous ownership records, and a list of regulations she would need to comply with. "You'll need to arrange removal within 90 days, he said without inflection. "Harbor Authority will assess daily fines after that. Environmental impact assessments are your responsibility. Salvage permits are separate and must be obtained before any work begins." She nodded, understanding perhaps half of what he said. The folder felt heavy in her hands, weighted with implications she couldn't yet see. As she walked back to the borrowed car, she heard the voices behind her, not directed at her, but loud enough to be heard. $700 for that thing. What's she planning to do, live on it? More like die on it. That hull's been sitting there for 3 years. It's a toxic mess. Some people have more hope than sense. She opened the car door, set the folder on the passenger seat, and allowed herself one slow breath before starting the engine. Emma was waiting at her friend's house, probably watching cartoons, unaware that her mother had just spent their security deposit on a rotting ship. Sarah had no plan, or no expertise, no reason to believe this decision was anything other than the final mistake in a series of mistakes that had brought her here. But she had noticed something in the auction photographs that the others had not. Or perhaps they had seen it and dismissed it as irrelevant. Either way, it didn't matter. What mattered was that when she looked at the image of the freighter, partially submerged and forgotten, she hadn't seen a wreck. She'd seen a door that no one else had bothered to open. The first time Sarah saw the freighter in person, it looked worse than the photographs had suggested. That was 3 days after the auction, after she had spent 72 hours reading every document in the folder. searching online for information about salvage rights and decommissioned vessels, and slowly piecing together what she had actually purchased. The folder described the ship as the Meridian, a light cargo freighter built in the early 1980s, originally registered in Panama, later reflagged under Liberian registry, and eventually seized by U.S. authorities during an investigation into customs violations that had never quite been explained in the public record. The vessel had sat in the harbor basin for nearly 4 years, ownership disputed, abandoned by its crew, ignored by everyone except the harbor authority, which sent increasingly urgent letters about removal costs and environmental hazards that no one answered. Eventually, the ship had been declared surplus property and placed into a distressed asset auction with the expectation that a scrap dealer would buy it cheap, cut it apart, and sell the metal by the ton. That hadn't happened. The costs of removal exceeded any value the hull might have, and experienced salvagers knew better than to touch something that came with more liability than profit. Sarah stood on the public dock that bordered the Northwest Basin, staring across 200 feet of oil-slicked water at her $700 investment. The freighter sat low in the water, its port side submerged past the lower deck, the starboard rail jutting into the air at an angle that looked precarious even from this distance. The hull was a patchwork of rust and marine growth, the white paint long since eroded into streaks and stains. The superstructure rose from the center of the deck, a boxy stack of metal that included the bridge, crew quarters, and what the documents called the deck house. The windows were dark, some broken, while others merely opaque with grime and salt residue. The mast and radar array tilted at the same angle as the hull, giving the entire structure a sense of frozen collapse, as if it had been caught mid-sinking and never quite finished the job. She had brought a pair of binoculars, borrowed like everything else, and lifted them now to study the details the naked eye missed. The hull bore a waterline that didn't match the ship's current depth, evidence that it had settled lower over time as compartments flooded or seals failed. The deck was littered with debris, ropes, and tarps, and pieces of equipment that had been left behind when the crew departed. Several of the cargo hatches stood open, their covers either removed or rusted off their hinges, exposing dark interiors that the binoculars couldn't penetrate. But what held her attention was the bridge. Even from this distance, she could see that the door to the wheelhouse hung slightly ajar, secured by a chain and padlock that looked newer than the rest of the ship. Someone had locked it after the vessel was abandoned, which meant someone had wanted to protect what remained inside. That detail had been absent from the auction materials, and she had only noticed it by zooming in on one of the background photographs, a small inconsistency that suggested the ship hadn't been completely stripped before it was left to rot. She lowered the binoculars and checked the paperwork again. According to the harbor authority, she was now legally responsible for the vessel. That meant she had the right to board it, though the same documents made it very clear that doing so was at her own risk. The language was explicit and unforgiving. The structure was unstable. The interior was likely flooded and toxic. Any injuries, deaths, or environmental damage would be her sole responsibility. She folded the papers and tucked them into her jacket. She had expected warnings. What she hadn't expected was how detailed the warnings were, as if someone had anticipated that a person might attempt this and wanted to be very clear about the consequences. The dock where she stood was public, but access to the basin itself was restricted by a chain-link fence and a locked gate. She had called the harbor authority that morning, asking about inspection access. The woman on the phone had been polite but unhelpful. Inspection permits required proof of insurance and a licensed marine surveyor. Insurance required evidence that the vessel was worth insuring. Surveyors charged fees she couldn't afford. The bureaucratic loop was perfect, designed to keep people like her exactly where she was, on the wrong side of the fence, staring at property she owned but couldn't touch. She returned to the car and drove along the perimeter of the basin, searching for another angle. The area was industrial, bordered by warehouses and storage yards, most of them fenced and gated. But at the far end of the basin, where the water narrowed into a channel that fed back toward the main harbor, she found a section where the fence had been cut. The gap was partially concealed by stacked pallets and rusted shipping containers, the kind of entry point used by people who had reasons to avoid official access. She parked and approached the gap cautiously. The area was deserted, no security cameras visible, no signs of recent activity. She slipped through the fence and walked carefully along the shoreline, stepping over cables and avoiding patches of oil-slicked mud. From this angle, the freighter was less than 50 feet away, close enough that she could hear water lapping against its hull and the faint groan of metal shifting under unseen pressure. A narrow service pier extended from the shore toward the vessel, its planks warped and slick with algae. She tested the first board with her weight, felt it flex but hold, and continued forward slowly, keeping her steps light and deliberate. Halfway along the pier, she stopped and studied the freighter again. Up close, the decay was more profound. The rust had eaten through sections of the hull, creating holes large enough to see into the ship's interior. Barnacles crusted the waterline in thick, irregular layers. The smell was stronger here, a mixture of stagnant water, diesel fuel, and rot. She could see movement inside some of the open hatches, shadows shifting as water sloshed back and forth with the tide. The pier didn't reach all the way to the ship, ending about 15 feet short of the hull. Someone had once secured a gangway there, but it had long since collapsed, leaving only twisted support brackets bolted to the pier and the freighter's deck. To board the vessel, she would need a ladder, a plank, or a very good reason to risk the jump across open water. She had none of those things. Not yet. Instead, she spent the next hour circling the basin on foot, approaching the freighter from every accessible angle, documenting what she could see with her phone's camera. She photographed the hull identification numbers, still faintly visible beneath layers of corrosion. She captured images of the cargo hatches, the bridge, the deck equipment. She recorded video as she walked, narrating what she observed in case she needed to reference it later. What she noticed most was what was missing. The ship had been abandoned, but it hadn't been looted. Commercial vessels, even decommissioned ones, usually attracted scavengers. Copper wiring, brass fittings, anything portable and sellable disappeared quickly once a ship was left unguarded. The Meridian still had its navigation lights, its deck winches, even its life rings hanging from the rail. Either no one had bothered to strip it, or someone had discouraged them from trying. By the time she returned to the car, the sun was lower, the shadows longer, and her understanding of what she owned had deepened without becoming clearer. She sat behind the wheel and reviewed the photos, zooming in on details, searching for patterns or clues. In one image, taken from the southern approach, she noticed something she had missed during the walk. The deckhouse door, the one with the newer padlock, bore faint scratches around the lock mechanism. Fresh scratches, their edges bright against the weathered metal. Someone had opened that door recently, not years ago when the crew left, but weeks or maybe days ago. That meant two things. First, whatever was inside the ship still mattered to someone. Second, she was not the only person interested in the Meridian. She started the engine and drove back toward the city, so her mind already working through the logistics of what came next. She needed access, equipment, and time. She had very little of the first, none of the second, and the third was running out faster than she wanted to admit. Emma's school would start again in 3 weeks. The borrowed car needed to be returned. The friend whose garage they were staying in had been patient, but patience had limits. That night, after Emma was asleep on the air mattress, Sarah sat on the floor of the garage with her laptop and continued her research. She read maritime salvage law until her eyes ached. She learned about environmental liens and how they could follow a property owner for decades. She discovered that most decommissioned vessels contained hazardous materials, asbestos, lead paint, fuel residue, and that removing them safely cost more than the ships were worth. She also read about the Meridian itself. Not much was publicly available, but she found a few references in old news archives. The ship had been seized during a customs investigation, something about undeclared cargo and missing manifests. The case had never gone to trial. The vessel's owner, a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands, had dissolved shortly after the seizure. The cargo, whatever it had been, was listed as unrecovered. That word stayed with her as she closed the laptop and lay down beside Emma. Unrecovered. Not missing. Not lost. Unrecovered, which implied that someone knew where it was, they just hadn't been able to get to it. She stared at the ceiling of the garage, listening to Emma's steady breathing and the distant hum of traffic. So $700. It had seemed like an absurd risk at the time, an act of desperation disguised as hope. Now, lying in the dark, she wondered if it had been something else entirely. A doorway. The mockery began in earnest the day she told her sister what she had done. Claire was older by 5 years, more settled, more practical, the kind of person who planned vacations 18 months in advance and kept spreadsheets for household expenses. She had offered to let Sarah and Emma stay in her garage, a temporary solution that had stretched into months, and Sarah knew she was running out of goodwill. They sat at Claire's kitchen table while Emma played in the backyard, visible through the window. Claire held the auction receipt in her hands, reading it slowly, her expression shifting from confusion to disbelief, and finally to something close to pity. "You bought a sinking ship," Claire said at last, her voice flat. "It's not sinking anymore. It's already sunk as far as it's going to." "That doesn't make it better, Sarah. It makes it worse." Claire set the receipt down carefully, as if it might contaminate the table. $700? That was your security deposit money. I know. You were supposed to be looking for an apartment. You were supposed to be getting back on your feet. I am. By buying a wreck that you can't even access without breaking about 15 laws? Claire's voice rose slightly, not quite anger, but close. What were you thinking? Sarah didn't answer immediately. She wasn't sure how to explain it. The feeling she'd had in the auction hall. The certainty that this was an opportunity disguised as a disaster. It sounded ridiculous even inside her own head. Out loud, it would sound worse. "There's something on that ship," she said finally. "Yeah, there's rust, and mold, and probably a few dead rats." "Sarah, listen to yourself. You don't know anything about ships. You don't have money for a salvage crew. You don't even have a place to live. What exactly do you think you're going to do with this thing?" "I'm going to figure it out." Claire sighed and rubbed her temples. "You can't keep doing this. You can't keep making impulsive decisions and hoping they'll work out. Emma needs stability. She needs a home, a routine, not a mother who's chasing some fantasy about a sunken freighter." The words landed harder than Claire probably intended. Sarah felt them settle in her chest, and familiar and heavy. She had heard variations of this speech from Claire before, from her ex-husband, from the social worker who had visited after Sarah lost the apartment. Everyone seemed to agree that she was the problem, that her choices were the issue, that if she would just be more careful, more practical, more like them, everything would be fine. "I'm trying," Sarah said quietly. "I know you are. But trying isn't enough if you're trying the wrong things." Claire softened slightly, reaching across the table to touch Sarah's hand. "Look, I love you. I want you to succeed. But you can't afford to make mistakes like this. You're one bad decision away from losing Emma. Do you understand that?" Sarah pulled her hand back slowly, her jaw tightening. "Emma is fine. She's living in a garage, Sarah. She doesn't have her own room. She's wearing clothes from the donation bin at school. That's not fine. Then maybe I should leave. If my mistakes are such a burden, maybe Emma and I should find somewhere else to stay. Claire's expression shifted again, frustration giving way to regret. That's not what I meant. Yes, it is. You think I'm a disaster. You think I'm dragging everyone down with me. Maybe you're right. Sarah. But she was already standing, already moving toward the door. Emma looked up from her game in the backyard, sensing the change in atmosphere, and Sarah forced a smile, waving her inside. They left 10 minutes later, Sarah's hands gripping the wheel tighter than necessary as she drove away from her sister's house with no destination in mind. The conversation followed her through the rest of the week. She heard echoes of it everywhere. When she stopped at the grocery store and counted coins to pay for bread and milk, she imagined Claire's voice commenting on her choices. When she called the harbor authority again, asking about cheaper permit options, she heard the same judgment in the clerk's patient explanations. When Emma asked why they couldn't go back to Aunt Claire's house, Sarah struggled to find an answer that didn't sound like an excuse. She had been stupid. That's what everyone thought. Stupid and desperate and naive. Maybe they were right. But then she thought about the scratches on the deckhouse lock, about the word unrecovered in the customs reports, about the way experienced salvagers had laughed at the auction and walked away. They had seen a liability. She had seen something else. The question was whether that something existed, or whether she had invented it out of desperation, the way drowning people sometimes imagine rescue where none is coming. She decided to find out. Accessing the freighter required more than determination. It required equipment, planning, and enough legal ambiguity to avoid immediate arrest. Sarah spent the next several days gathering what she needed, most of it borrowed, some of it improvised. A friend from one of her old cleaning jobs lent her a kayak and a life vest. A neighbor who worked construction gave her a climbing harness, a coil of rope, and advice she only half understood about securing anchor points. She bought a pair of work gloves, a flashlight that claimed to be waterproof, and a small crowbar from a hardware store clearance bin. She told Emma they were going on an adventure. That wasn't entirely a lie. Emma, who had grown used to uncertainty and learned not to ask too many questions, simply nodded and asked if they could bring snacks. They returned to the harbor basin early on a Sunday morning, a time when the industrial district was deserted and the chances of being seen were lowest. Sarah parked in the same hidden spot as before and led Emma through the gap in the fence, carrying the kayak between them. Emma thought it was exciting, a secret mission, and Sarah didn't correct her. Sometimes it was easier to let children interpret the world through a lens that made sense to them. The service pier was empty, the water calm. Sarah secured the kayak at the edge, checking the straps and buckles 3 times before she allowed Emma to step inside. She handed her the bag of snacks and a waterproof pouch containing Sarah's phone. "You're going to stay right here," Sarah said, kneeling beside the kayak so they were eye level. "You're going to sit in the kayak, and you're not going to move. If anyone comes, anyone at all, you call me. Understand?" Emma nodded, her expression serious. "Are you going on the big boat?" "Just for a little while. I need to check something." "Is it dangerous?" Sarah hesitated. Lying to children was easy. Lying to your own child while looking into her eyes was harder. "It might be. That's why I need you to stay here and be very, very careful." "I will." Sarah kissed her forehead and stood, pulling the climbing harness over her shoulders and adjusting the straps. The rope went over one shoulder, the crowbar tucked into a loop at her waist. She had watched videos online about how to approach unstable structures, some about weight distribution and testing surfaces before committing your weight. None of it felt adequate now that she stood at the edge of the pier, staring across the gap toward the freighter's rusted hull. The water between the pier and the ship looked deceptively calm, its surface smooth and dark. She knew from the documents that the basin was deep here, at least 30 feet, and the water was polluted enough that swimming in it was illegal. If she fell, the life vest would keep her afloat, but the cold and the contamination would do the rest. She knelt at the edge of the pier and studied the hull. The lowest point of the starboard side dipped close to the waterline, low enough that she might be able to reach it with a jump if she timed it carefully. The metal was slick with algae and moisture, but there were handholds, rusted brackets and bent railings that protruded at irregular intervals. She took a breath, steadied herself, and jumped. Her hands caught the rail on the first try, her fingers closing around cold, rough metal. Her body swung forward, and for a moment, she hung suspended, feet dangling above the water. Then she pulled, using arm strength she didn't know she had, and hauled herself up onto the slanted deck. She lay there for a moment, breathing hard, adrenaline sharpening her senses. From the pier, Emma watched with wide eyes, her small hand raised in a tentative wave. Sarah waved back, then stood carefully, testing the deck's stability. The surface was treacherous, angled enough that she had to brace herself constantly. She moved slowly, stepping over coils of rotted rope and shattered glass, heading toward the deckhouse. Up close, the damage was more extensive than it had appeared from shore. Entire sections of railing had collapsed. The cargo hatches gaped open like wounds. Water sloshed audibly below deck, a constant reminder that the ship was more liquid than solid now. She reached the deckhouse door and examined the padlock. It was new, just as she'd suspected, a heavy-duty model that would resist casual attempts to remove it. But the door frame itself was old, corroded, weakened by years of saltwater exposure. She wedged the crowbar into the gap between the door and the frame, positioned her weight, and pulled. The frame bent. Metal groaned. The lock held, but the screws securing the hasp pulled free, and the door swung open with a sound like tearing fabric. Inside, the deckhouse was dark and smelled of mildew and stagnant air. She turned on the flashlight and swept the beam across the interior. What she saw made her pause. The wheelhouse was intact, not pristine, but preserved in a way that suggested intentional care. The navigation equipment had been removed, leaving empty brackets and disconnected cables. But the furniture remained. A captain's chair bolted to the floor, charts pinned to a wall, yellowed and curling, a logbook resting on a shelf, its cover warped by moisture, but still closed. And in the far corner, partially hidden behind a collapsed section of ceiling panel, she saw the safe. It was small, industrial, the kind used to secure documents and valuables on commercial vessels. Its door was closed, the locking mechanism showing no obvious signs of damage. Someone had left it behind, either unable to open it or unwilling to try. Sarah approached it slowly, her flashlight beam steady on the safe's surface. The metal was pitted with rust, but the seals around the door looked intact. She knelt and examined the lock. It was mechanical, requiring a combination rather than a key. The dial turned smoothly under her gloved fingers, showing no resistance. Her heart pounded steadily, rhythmically, as if her body understood the significance of this moment before her mind caught up. She had found what she was looking for, or rather, she had found the place where it might be. Whether it contained anything worth the $700, the mockery, the risk, she wouldn't know until she opened it. And opening it would require time she didn't have and tools she didn't own. She took photographs of the safe from multiple angles, documenting its position, like the serial number stamped into its door, the condition of the surrounding area. Then she stood and surveyed the rest of the deckhouse, her flashlight revealing additional details. Papers scattered across the floor, their ink faded beyond readability. A broken radio mounted to the wall, a coffee mug wedged into a corner, the liquid inside long since evaporated into a dark stain. This room told a story, but it was one she couldn't read yet. She needed more time, more light, more understanding of what she was looking at. From the pier, Emma's voice called out, high and clear, "Mama, someone's coming!" Sarah's breath caught. She moved to the door and looked out across the deck toward the shore. A figure approached along the perimeter fence, too far away to identify but moving with purpose. Security, possibly. Or someone who had seen the kayak and decided to investigate. She couldn't afford to be caught here. Not yet. Not before she understood what this place held. She pulled the deckhouse door closed as best she could, the broken frame refusing to seal completely, and made her way back across the deck. The jump back to the pier was harder than the first leap, gravity working against her, but she landed on her stomach and scrambled forward before she could slide back into the water. Emma helped pull her up, small hands surprisingly strong. Sarah grabbed the kayak and half-carried, half-dragged it back through the gap in the fence. By the time they reached the car, her hands were shaking, and her clothes were soaked with sweat and harbor water. They drove away quickly, Emma clutching the snack bag and asking questions Sarah couldn't answer yet. As they merged into traffic, heading back toward the city, Sarah glanced in the rearview mirror at the basin disappearing behind them. The safe was there. That much she knew. What it contained, and whether anyone else knew about it, remained questions that would haunt her through the long night ahead. The figure at the fence had been a harbor patrol officer doing a routine check. Sarah learned this 3 days later, when she returned to the basin during daylight hours, approaching openly this time, clipboard in hand, trying to look like someone who belonged there. The officer was gone, but his presence had left traces. Fresh tire tracks in the gravel, a new notice posted on the gate warning about trespassing and unauthorized access to maritime property. She photographed the notice without touching it, then circled the perimeter again, but searching for another way in. The gap in the fence had been repaired, welded shut with fresh metal that gleamed against the rusted links. Someone was paying attention now. Whether that attention was routine or specific to her visit, she couldn't determine. But the message was clear. The easy access was gone. That night, she sat in a public library using their internet, researching safe cracking techniques with the systematic focus of someone who had no other options. The videos she found were either obviously illegal or uselessly vague. Tutorial from locksmiths who carefully avoided explaining anything that might actually work. Demonstrations by security experts who showed techniques while emphasizing that attempting them without authorization was a felony. She learned that the safe on the freighter was likely a Class C marine vault, designed to resist moisture and moderate force, secured by a 3-number combination lock. The mechanism itself was simple, mechanical rather than electronic, which meant it was vulnerable to certain techniques if you had time, patience, and enough understanding of how the internal pins aligned when the correct numbers were entered. What she didn't have was formal training. What she did have was desperation sharpened into focus and 3 sleepless nights to study every detail she could find. The library closed at 9. She drove back to the garage where she and Emma were no longer staying, having moved to a weekly motel after the argument with Claire. The room cost $200 a week, paid in cash, and came with stained carpet, a microwave that sparked when used, and a door lock that required force to engage. Emma slept in the single bed. Sarah slept on the floor, using a blanket as a mattress. She didn't tell Emma about the safe. She didn't tell anyone. The fewer people who knew, the fewer ways the information could spread. She had learned that lesson early in her financial collapse, when friends and family who claimed to want to help had instead used her struggles as conversation topics, sharing her failures with the casual cruelty of people who felt their own lives were stable enough to judge. The motel manager, a man named Ray, who wore the same stained polo shirt every day, knocked on her door the 4th morning she was there. "You're paid through tomorrow," he said, when she opened the door, not looking at her directly. "After that, I need to see another 200 or you're out." "I'll have it." That's what the last person said. Maintenance found 3 weeks of garbage in the room after they left. "I'll have it," she repeated, her voice flat. He studied her for a moment, his expression caught between skepticism and indifference, then shrugged. "Your call." She closed the door and leaned against it, eyes shut. $200. She had $63 in her wallet and $17 in her checking account. Emma's school supplies would cost another $40. Food, gas, the laundromat, everything else. It all required money she didn't have and couldn't borrow anymore. The safe wasn't just an opportunity. It was the only opportunity. She left Emma with a neighbor at the motel, a woman named Gloria, who watched daytime television and asked no questions as long as Sarah paid her $10. Then she drove back to the harbor, for arriving just after dawn when the light was gray and the air smelled of salt and diesel. The repaired fence didn't matter. She had found another way. The basin connected to the main harbor through a narrow channel bordered by a seawall and an abandoned fish processing plant. The plant had been closed for years, its windows boarded, its loading docks sagging into the water. But the property wasn't fenced, and the seawall extended close enough to the meridian that someone with a kayak and enough nerve could approach from the opposite direction, hidden from the main basin by the freighter's bulk. She launched the kayak from a crumbling boat ramp behind the plant, paddling quietly through water that looked thicker than it should, colored with rainbow sheens of leaked fuel. The freighter appeared gradually as she rounded the seawall, its rusted hull rising like a wall that had been designed to keep people out. The climb was harder this time. The tide was lower, the handholds farther apart, and her arms still ached from the previous attempt. But she made it, pulling herself onto the deck and lying flat for a moment, catching her breath, listening for sounds of activity. The basin was quiet. No boats, no voices, only the steady slap of water against metal. She entered the deck house through the broken door, her flashlight cutting through shadows that seemed denser than before. The safe remained where she had left it, untouched, its surface reflecting the light in dull patterns. She knelt in front of it and set down the bag she'd brought. Inside were the tools she'd gathered, a stethoscope borrowed from a friend who worked as a nurse, a small notepad and pencil, a tube of graphite lubricant, and a mechanic's dial caliper she'd bought from a pawnshop for $8. The safe-cracking tutorials had emphasized patience. You didn't force these mechanisms, you listened, you felt. You learned the safe's language through the subtle feedback of metal sliding against metal. She pressed the stethoscope against the safe's door, just above the dial, and began turning the dial slowly clockwise. The numbers passed beneath her fingers, smooth and silent at first. Then, at what felt like the 7th rotation, she heard it, a faint click, barely audible even through the stethoscope, but distinct. She marked the position on her notepad. 17. She reset the dial and tried again, this time counterclockwise, listening for the next click. It took 4 attempts before she heard it, now her concentration so complete that she didn't notice the ache in her knees or the cold seeping through her jeans. 29. The third number was harder. The tutorials had warned that some safes had multiple false gates, positions that felt right, but weren't. She spent an hour testing combinations, writing down possibilities, eliminating options through trial and error that felt less like skill and more like prayer. Somewhere above deck, metal groaned as the freighter shifted slightly with the tide. She froze, listening, but the sound didn't repeat. Just the ship settling, adjusting its weight against the water that held it. She returned to the dial. By midday, when the light through the broken deckhouse door had shifted from gray to pale yellow, she had narrowed the third number to 3 possibilities. 41, 43, and 45. She tried 41 first. The dial turned. The mechanism clicked. Nothing happened. 43. The same result. She paused, her hands trembling slightly now, not from fear, but from fatigue and the sustained adrenaline that had kept her focused for hours. If 45 didn't work, she would have to start over, recalibrate, reconsider every assumption. She turned the dial to 45 and pulled the handle. The safe opened. The hinges protested with a low squeal that seemed too loud in the confined space, but the door swung outward smoothly, revealing the interior. At first, in the dim light, she couldn't process what she was seeing. The space was smaller than she expected, perhaps 18 inches deep and a foot wide. But it wasn't empty. Inside were 3 objects: a manila envelope, water-stained, but sealed; a small leather-bound journal, its cover warped by moisture; and a canvas bag, military style, its drawstring pulled tight. She reached for the envelope first, her gloved hands careful as she peeled back the flap. Inside were documents, bills of lading, shipping manifests, pages of typed text she didn't immediately understand. She set them aside and picked up the journal. The entries inside were handwritten, dated, organized like a captain's log. She flipped through the pages quickly, catching fragments: coordinates, dates, mentions of cargo. One entry, near the middle, stopped her. Secondary shipment secured below main cargo deck. Manifest omitted per agreement. Delivery contingent on receiving confirmation code. No contact since departure. Situation uncertain. She read the entry twice, then continued through the journal. The dates progressed, the entries growing shorter, more tense. References to delays. Mentions of authorities. A final entry, written in a hand that looked rushed. Cannot risk discovery. Moved secondary shipment to captain's vault. Will retrieve after situation resolves. If this is found by anyone other than original party, contents are legally seized property. Advise immediate contact with Port Authority Customs Division. Sarah closed the journal and stared at the canvas bag. Her hands hovered over it for a moment, hesitant, as if touching it might complete a transformation she couldn't reverse. Then she pulled the drawstring. The bag opened with a soft whisper of fabric. Inside, nested in what looked like old chamois cloth, were stones. She lifted one carefully, holding it up to the light filtering through the broken door. It was clear, and multifaceted, heavier than she expected for its size. The light bent through it in colors that seemed impossible, blues and whites, and fragments of rainbow that moved as she turned it. She had never seen a diamond in person before, not a real one. Her engagement ring had been cubic zirconia, a fact her ex-husband had revealed during one of their final arguments, a small cruelty delivered with precision. This was not cubic zirconia. She set it down carefully and looked into the bag again. There were more, many more. They filled the bag, sorted into smaller cloth pouches by size, each pouch tied with cotton string and marked with faded pencil notations she couldn't read. Her breathing had become shallow, her pulse too fast. She forced herself to slow down, to think clearly. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. People didn't find this kind of thing. People like her, especially, didn't stumble into solutions this complete, this absolute. But the weight of the stones in her hand was real. The journal entry was real. The safe had been locked for years, waiting, and she had opened it. She took out her phone and activated the camera, photographing everything methodically. The safe's interior, the documents, the journal pages, the bag of stones. She documented their position, their condition, the markings on the pouches. Then she sat back and allowed herself to process what this meant. The diamonds were stolen. That much was clear from the journal. They had been part of a shipment that was never declared, hidden during a customs investigation, abandoned when the ship was seized. Whoever had hidden them had either been arrested or had fled, for leaving the stones behind with the expectation of eventual recovery. That recovery had never happened. Now, legally, she didn't know what she owned. The ship was hers, purchased at auction. Did that extend to everything on the ship? The laws of maritime salvage were complex, full of exceptions and precedents. Seized property, contraband, stolen goods, all of those categories carried different rules. What she knew with absolute certainty was that if she reported this immediately, the diamonds would disappear into evidence lockup. There would be investigations, hearings, claims from multiple parties. She would be questioned, probably suspected, possibly charged with something, even if she had done nothing wrong except open a safe she legally had access to. And while all of that unfolded, Emma would go into foster care because Sarah had no stable housing, no income, and no way to prove she could provide adequate care during a federal investigation. The other option was silence. She looked at the bag again, at the journal, at the documents. If she took them now, quietly, she would be committing theft. Except it wasn't theft if the property was already hers. Except it might be, depending on how maritime law interpreted seized contraband found years after a case was closed. The law was a maze, and she had no guide. What she had instead was a daughter sleeping in a motel room that cost $200 a week. She had $17 in her checking account and $63 in her wallet. She had a sister who thought she was a disaster, and a society that had been waiting patiently for her to fail completely so it could take the one thing she had left. She put the journal and documents back into the safe. Then, moving slowly, she took the canvas bag and secured it inside her backpack, cushioning it with the extra clothing she'd brought. She closed the safe, spun the dial, and stood. The deckhouse felt different now, smaller, as if the space itself had contracted around the weight of her decision. She had crossed a line, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. She left the freighter the way she had come, climbing down to the kayak, paddling back to the abandoned plant. The bag in her backpack seemed heavier than physics would allow, as if gravity itself had increased to match the magnitude of what she carried. By the time she reached the motel, the sun had set. Emma was watching television with Gloria, her small face illuminated by the screen's glow. Sarah paid Gloria the $10, thanked her, and led Emma back to their room. She didn't open the bag that night. She didn't count the stones or try to assess their value. She simply placed the backpack in the closet, locked the door, and lay down on the floor beside Emma's bed. Sleep didn't come. Instead, she stared at the ceiling and replayed every choice that had led her here, from the auction to the kayak to the moment the safe had opened. At any point, she could have stopped. She could have walked away, reported the discovery, trusted the system to handle it fairly. But she hadn't. And now the question wasn't whether she had made the right choice, because there had been no right choice. The question was what she would do next. Now that she carried $314 million in stolen diamonds in a backpack hidden in a motel closet, and no one in the world except her knew they existed. The answer came to her slowly, assembling itself from fragments of desperation and pragmatism. She couldn't sell the diamonds immediately. Any attempt to offload them in bulk would trigger questions she couldn't answer. But she could sell them slowly, carefully, one at a time, through channels that didn't ask for provenance or paperwork. She had seen enough true crime documentaries to know that criminals got caught, not because they committed crimes, but because they made mistakes afterward. They spent too quickly. They trusted the wrong people. They drew attention to themselves with sudden wealth that didn't match their documented income. She wouldn't make those mistakes. The next morning, she took a single diamond from the bag, one of the smaller stones, perhaps 2 carats, its facets catching the dull light from the motel window. She wrapped it carefully in tissue paper and placed it in her wallet. Then she drove to a pawnshop on the far side of the city, a place she'd never been before, where no one knew her name or her story. The shop smelled like old leather and cigarettes. Behind the counter, a man with tattooed forearms and reading glasses perched on his nose looked up as she entered. "Help you?" She placed the diamond on the counter between them. "I need to sell this." He picked it up, studied it briefly, then reached for a jeweler's loupe. The examination took less than a minute. When he set the stone down, his expression hadn't changed. "Where'd you get this?" "It was my grandmother's." "Your grandmother had good taste." He wrote a number on a piece of paper and slid it across the counter. "That's what I can offer." Sarah looked at the number. $1,200. She knew instinctively that the stone was worth far more. But she also knew that negotiating would create memory, would make her stand out. So she nodded. "Cash?" "Always." The transaction took 5 minutes. He didn't ask for identification. She didn't offer it. When she left the shop, she had $1,200 in her wallet and one less diamond in the bag. Over the next 2 weeks, she visited 6 more pawnshops, each in a different part of the city. She never sold more than 1 stone at a time. She never went back to the same shop twice. She varied her story: grandmother's inheritance, estate sale purchase, gift from an ex-boyfriend who turned out to be married. The details didn't matter. What mattered was that each transaction was small enough to avoid scrutiny, but large enough to keep her moving forward. The money accumulated slowly. 1,500 here, 2,000 there. She paid for another 2 weeks at the motel. She bought Emma new school clothes and shoes that fit. She opened a bank account at a credit union across town and deposited the money in increments that wouldn't trigger reporting requirements. But even as her immediate crisis eased, a new tension built beneath the surface. She had taken 20 stones from the bag, barely a fraction of what remained. At this pace, it would take years to convert them all to cash, and every transaction carried risk. More concerning were the questions that had started circling at the edges of her awareness. The safe hadn't been opened in years. The journal made it clear that someone had intended to return for the diamonds. That person had either died, been imprisoned, or simply given up. But what if they hadn't? What if someone was still watching, waiting for movement, paying attention to transactions that matched the description of stones that had vanished from official records decades ago? She had no way to know, no way to measure the danger except through the silence that continued, unbroken, day after day. The call came on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after she'd opened the safe. She was walking Emma to school when her phone rang, an unknown number with a local area code. She almost didn't answer. But something made her stop, and step aside from the flow of other parents and children, and accept the call. "Sarah Mitchell." The voice was male, professional, neither friendly nor hostile. "Yes." "This is David Chen from Harbor Services Division. I'm calling regarding the vessel you purchased at auction 3 weeks ago, the Meridian." Her stomach tightened. "Yes?" "We've had reports of unauthorized access to the property, specifically someone boarding the vessel during non-business hours. Can you confirm whether you or anyone acting on your behalf has been accessing the ship?" She kept her voice steady, measured. "I boarded it once to conduct an initial assessment. I'm the legal owner. I didn't realize I needed permission." "Technically you do. Maritime properties require proper notification and safety protocols, especially when the vessel is in such poor condition. The concern is liability. If something happens to you on that ship, the harbor authority could be held responsible." "I understand. It won't happen again." There was a pause, the kind that suggested he was reading from notes or waiting for someone else's input. "There's also the matter of removal. You're approaching the 60-day mark of your 90-day window. Have you made arrangements for salvage? I'm working on it. I'd encourage you to work faster. Daily fines begin after 90 days, and they're substantial. $200 per day, accumulating until the vessel is removed or you default on ownership. $200 per day, the same amount as her weekly motel rent. In a month, it would be $6,000. In 6 months, $36,000. The number grew exponentially, designed to force action. I'll have it removed, she said, though she had no idea how. Good. I'll note that in the file. And Ms. Mitchell, please don't board the vessel again without proper authorization, for your own safety. The call ended. She stood on the sidewalk, Emma tugging at her hand, asking why they'd stopped. Sarah forced a smile and continued walking, her mind racing. Someone had seen her. The kayak, the climb, the time she'd spent inside the deckhouse. Someone had noticed and reported it, and now the harbor authority was paying attention. Worse, the 90-day deadline wasn't just an administrative inconvenience, it was a countdown. Once the fines started, they would accumulate faster than she could ever hope to pay them. The ship would be declared abandoned again, seized, and this time sold to someone who actually had the resources to remove it. And if that happened, if the freighter was sold again, the safe would be discovered. The journal would be read. The missing diamonds would be traced. She had assumed time was on her side. She had been wrong. That night, after Emma was asleep, Sarah spread the diamonds across the motel bed. She had taken 40 from the bag so far. Hundreds remained. At her current pace, she could maybe sell another 100 before the deadline. That would leave her with enough cash to survive for a while, to find an apartment, to stabilize. But it wouldn't solve the fundamental problem. The freighter was evidence. As long as it existed, it was a threat. And she had no way to make it disappear without drawing exactly the kind of attention that would unravel everything. She gathered the stones carefully, returning them to the bag, and sat on the floor with her back against the bed. The room was quiet except for Emma's steady breathing and the distant sound of traffic on the highway. For the first time since opening the safe, she allowed herself to acknowledge the full weight of what she had done. She had stolen property that wasn't legally hers. She had sold stolen goods across state lines. She had lied to pawnshop owners and harbor officials. Every step had been justified by necessity, by the need to protect Emma, by the certainty that the system wouldn't help her if she asked. But justification didn't change the facts. She was a criminal now. Not in the dramatic sense, not in the way movies portrayed it. She hadn't hurt anyone. She hadn't threatened anyone. She had simply taken something that had been abandoned and convinced herself she deserved it more than whoever had hidden it there decades ago. The question was whether she could live with that, whether she could carry this secret forward into whatever life came next, always aware that discovery meant losing not just the money, but Emma. As she sat there in the dim light of the motel room, she realized something that should have been obvious from the start. The diamonds weren't her salvation. They were her burden, and the only way to be free of them was to finish what she'd started, completely, before the ship disappeared and took her chance with it. She had 61 days left. The urgency transformed everything. What had been careful, methodical, almost meditative in its precision, became rapid, calculated, and relentlessly focused. Sarah could no longer afford to sell one diamond at a time over the course of weeks. She needed to move faster, smarter, and with a level of coordination that required help she couldn't trust. So she didn't ask for help. Instead, she researched. The library became her second home, Emma doing homework at a nearby table, while Sarah scrolled through articles about gemstone markets, jewelry districts in major cities, private buyers who dealt in estate liquidation. She learned that diamonds, unlike gold, weren't easily traced once removed from their settings. The Gemological Institute of America maintained records of certified stones, but most stones were never certified. They moved through the market on trust, appearance, and the willingness of buyers not to ask uncomfortable questions. She also learned that bulk sales attracted attention. Anyone attempting to move dozens of high-quality diamonds at once would trigger money laundering protocols, IRS audits, and potentially criminal investigations. The smarter approach, according to the forums she found buried deep in internet searches, was to work through intermediaries. People who bought stones without documentation, held them until the market shifted, then resold them through legitimate channels years later after the trail had gone cold. Finding those intermediaries required entering circles she had no natural access to. But desperation had a way of opening doors, especially when you were willing to walk through them, knowing you might not come back out. The first contact came through a pawnshop owner in Oakland. She had sold him 3 stones over the past 2 weeks, small transactions that shouldn't have registered. But on her 4th visit, when she placed another diamond on the counter, he didn't reach for his loupe immediately. "You're moving a lot of these," he said instead. "Family estate. There are more." "How many more?" She hesitated. This was the moment where silence was safer. But silence wouldn't solve her problem. "Enough that I'd be interested in a bulk arrangement, if the price was fair." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I know someone who handles acquisitions. No questions, no paperwork. But he doesn't work with just anyone. You'd need a reference." "Consider this the reference." She took out 5 diamonds and placed them beside the first. They caught the light from the shop's fluorescent fixtures, scattering fragments of color across the counter. He picked up one, examined it, set it down. "Where'd you really get these? Does it matter?" To him, no. To me, yeah. Because if you're about to bring heat down on my shop, I need to know. Sarah met his gaze steadily. "No one's looking for them. They've been in a safe for 30 years. The person who put them there is dead or gone. I'm just cleaning up what's left." It wasn't entirely a lie. Close enough to the truth that her voice didn't waver. He reached under the counter and took out a business card. No name, just a phone number printed in plain black text. "Call after 9 p.m. Tell him Eddie sent you. Don't use your real name." She took the card, pocketed the 5 diamonds, and left. The transaction felt different from the others, heavier with implication. She had moved from casual seller to someone actively seeking criminal infrastructure. The line she'd crossed weeks ago was now a distant memory, and ahead lay territory she couldn't map in advance. She made the call 3 nights later from a burner phone purchased at a convenience store with cash. The voice that answered was neutral, almost bored. "Yeah. Eddie gave me this number." A pause. "What do you have?" "Diamonds. Unset. Various sizes. Clean." "How many?" She had counted them carefully the night before. After the stones she'd already sold, 307 remained in the bag. 300? Maybe a few more. The pause lasted longer this time. When he spoke again, the boredom was gone. "That's not a casual estate sale." "No." "Where'd they come from?" "Somewhere they're not missed." "That's not an answer. It's the only one you're getting." Another silence. Then, "Nah, Eddie trusts you enough to give you my number. That counts for something. But I'm not meeting you anywhere public, and I'm not buying anything without verification. You want to do this, you come to me. Alone. Cash transaction, no records." He gave her an address in Richmond, an industrial area near the old naval shipyard. She wrote it down, repeated it back to confirm, and ended the call. The meeting was set for 2 days later. She spent those 48 hours in a state of controlled anxiety, going through the motions of normal life, while preparing for something that felt like stepping off a cliff with no certainty of landing. She couldn't take all 300 stones to the meeting. If something went wrong, if this was a setup or a robbery, she'd lose everything. So she selected 30, a mix of sizes that would demonstrate the range of quality without representing her entire inventory. The rest she hid, not in the motel room where they could be discovered by housekeeping or theft, but in a storage locker she rented under a false name, paid for 3 months in advance with cash. The night before the meeting, she lay awake beside Emma and considered calling the whole thing off. She could continue as she'd been doing, selling stones slowly, carefully, over years if necessary. It would take longer, but it would be safer. Except she didn't have years. She had 53 days before the harbor fines began. 53 days to either remove the freighter or lose ownership, and with it, any claim to legitimacy she might construct later. The meeting location was exactly what she expected. A warehouse with broken windows and a loading dock that hadn't seen commercial use in years. She parked 2 blocks away and walked, her backpack containing the diamonds held close to her body, her phone's emergency contact already dialed, ready to call if she pressed send. The man waiting inside introduced himself as Marcus. He was mid-50s, wearing a suit that looked expensive but not flashy, and he carried himself with the casual authority of someone accustomed to uncomfortable situations. "You're younger than I expected," he said. "You're older." That earned a brief smile. "Show me what you have." She set the backpack on a folding table and removed one of the cloth pouches. Marcus took it, opened it, and poured the contents onto a black velvet cloth he'd brought. The stones scattered across the dark surface, and he leaned forward, on examining them with a jeweler's loupe. The inspection took 20 minutes. He said nothing during that time, his focus complete. When he finally straightened, his expression was carefully neutral. "These are real, high quality. Some of them are exceptional. I know. What you probably don't know is that stones like this have history. They're not synthetic. They're old cut, probably from African mines before modern regulations. Whoever originally owned these knew what they were doing. Can you move them?" "I can, but not all at once, and not without taking a significant cut. Stones without documentation sell at a discount. Buyers assume risk, so they pay less. What you're holding in that bag is worth maybe 10 million if you had proper certification. Without it," he gestured vaguely, "half that. Maybe less, and depending on how fast you want to move them." 10 million. The number hung in the air between them, absurd and impossible. She had thought the diamonds were valuable, but she hadn't allowed herself to believe in a number that large. Half of that was still $5 million. More money than she could conceptualize, more than she'd earn in 10 lifetimes. "How fast can you move 30 stones?" Marcus considered. 2 months, if I'm careful. I have buyers in 3 different cities who don't coordinate. I'll sell them in small lots, mix them in with other acquisitions. You'll get paid in installments as each lot clears. I need cash faster than that. Then you'll take a bigger discount. 40% of market value if you want it in 3 weeks, 35% if you can wait 6. She did the math quickly. From 30 stones at 40% of market value, assuming an average price she couldn't accurately estimate. Maybe 200,000, maybe less. It was a fraction of what the stones were truly worth, but it was also more money than she'd held in her entire life. 3 weeks, 40%. Marcus nodded. "I'll need all 30 stones now. You'll get the money in 3 payments. First payment in 1 week as a show of good faith. The rest when the stones clear." It was a risk. She had no guarantee he wouldn't simply disappear with the diamonds, no legal recourse if he cheated her. But she'd already committed to this path. Hesitating now would only compound the danger without reducing it. She handed him the pouches. He counted the stones carefully, making notes in a small ledger, then produced a receipt of sorts, a handwritten summary of the transaction with no names, just a transaction code and the agreed terms. "If you have more," he said as she prepared to leave, "I can handle them. But not all at once. This kind of volume attracts attention we both want to avoid. I'll keep that in mind." She left the warehouse, walked back to her car, and drove carefully through the darkening streets, her hands steady on the wheel despite the adrenaline flooding her system. The first payment arrived exactly 1 week later. Marcus had her meet him at a different location, a parking lot behind a strip mall. He handed her an envelope containing cash, $25,000, mostly in hundreds. She counted it in her car, then deposited it in 3 separate banks, each deposit under $10,000 to avoid triggering reporting requirements. But the process took all afternoon, Emma sitting patiently in the back seat, playing games on an old tablet, while Sarah moved from bank to bank, filling out deposit slips with hands that no longer trembled. By the time she returned to the motel that evening, exhausted and hollow, she understood that the transformation was complete. She was no longer Sarah Mitchell, who had made a desperate gamble at an auction. She was someone else now, someone who laundered money and made deals in empty warehouses, someone who had learned to move through the world with a secret so large it changed the shape of everything around her. And the diamonds were still there, waiting, hundreds of them, worth millions she could barely imagine. The freighter remained her problem, but now, for the first time since she'd opened that safe, she had enough money to think about solutions. She had 46 days left to figure out what they were. The second payment arrived on schedule. Marcus handed her another envelope, this one thicker, containing $75,000. She counted it in her car again, the ritual now familiar, almost calming. Emma slept in the back seat, her small body curled beneath a blanket, unaware that her mother now held more cash than most people earned in 2 years. The third payment came a week later, $100,000, completing the agreed transaction for 30 stones. Sarah deposited the money carefully, spreading it across multiple accounts, always staying below reporting thresholds, always moving with the cautious precision of someone who understood that wealth attracted attention as surely as poverty attracted judgment. With $195,000 now distributed across 6 different banks, she began the work that would either secure her future or destroy it completely. The freighter had to be dealt with, not just removed, but eliminated as evidence, and that meant finding someone who could make a vessel disappear without asking questions she couldn't answer. The solution came from an unexpected source. Gloria, the motel neighbor who watched Emma, mentioned during one of their brief exchanges that her nephew worked in shipbreaking. The conversation had been casual, forgettable, but Sarah had filed it away, the way she now filed away every piece of information that might prove useful. She asked Gloria for the nephew's contact information, framing it as legitimate inquiry. She was the legal owner of a decommissioned vessel. She needed it removed before the harbor authorities' deadline. Everything about the request was technically true, even if the motivations beneath it were something else entirely. The nephew's name was Tommy. He ran a small salvage operation that handled jobs the larger companies ignored, vessels too damaged or too contaminated to be worth the effort. He agreed to meet her at a diner near the harbor, and when she explained what she needed, his response was immediate. "That's the Meridian. I know that ship. Been sitting in the basin for years. Can you remove it?" "I can cut it apart and haul it out in pieces. Environmental compliance will cost extra. So will disposal fees. The hull's probably got fuel residue, asbestos, maybe PCBs. None of that's cheap to handle properly." "How much?" He did calculations on a napkin, his handwriting surprisingly neat. $45,000, all in. That includes labor, equipment rental, hazmat disposal, and expediting the permits. I can have it done in 3 weeks if you need it fast." It was more than she'd hoped to spend, but far less than the fines would accumulate to if she did nothing. 30,000, she countered. Cash, half up front, half when it's gone. Tommy studied her for a moment, then nodded. Deal. But if we find anything hazardous beyond what I estimated, you cover the overage. Agreed. They shook hands. She gave him $15,000 the next day, meeting him in the same diner, the cash exchanged in a manila envelope that could have contained anything. He didn't count it, didn't ask where it came from. He simply pocketed it and told her he'd start work on Monday. The cutting began 4 days later. Sarah watched from a distance, binoculars in hand, as Tommy's crew arrived with cutting torches and a barge-mounted crane. The meridian came apart slowly, section by section, the work methodical and surprisingly quiet. The environmental crew worked in hazmat suits, containing fuel leaks and bagging contaminated materials. The metal sections were loaded onto flatbed trucks and hauled away, destined for recycling facilities that melted them down without questions about origin. Within 2 weeks, the freighter was gone. The basin where it had rested for years showed nothing but disturbed water and a slight discoloration that would fade with the next tide. The harbor authority was notified of the removal, the paperwork filed, the case closed. Sarah Mitchell had fulfilled her obligation. The vessel she'd purchased for $700 no longer existed. Neither did the safe, the journal, or any evidence that diamonds had ever been hidden aboard. She paid Tommy the remaining $15,000, and he handed her a disposal receipt documenting that all materials had been handled according to environmental regulations. Whether that was true, she didn't ask. What mattered was that the paper trail ended cleanly, with no loose threads that might unravel later. With the freighter eliminated and $165,000 remaining after expenses, she allowed herself to breathe for the first time in weeks. The immediate crisis was over, but the larger situation remained. She still had 277 diamonds hidden in a storage locker, worth, according to Marcus's conservative estimates, from somewhere between $4 and $6 million at the discounted rates she'd be forced to accept. She called Marcus from a different burner phone and arranged another meeting. This time, when they sat across from each other in a different empty warehouse, the conversation was more direct. "I have more," she said. "Significantly more." Marcus didn't react with surprise. "How many?" 277. He was quiet for a long moment, processing. "That's a problem." "Why?" "Because volume creates patterns. I can move 30 stones over a few months without raising flags. But 277? That requires a different kind of infrastructure. International buyers, shell companies, layered transactions. It also means you're sitting on something worth serious money. Conservatively, we're talking about $8 to $10 million market value. Even at 50% discount, you're looking at $4 to $5 million in cash." The number hung between them, too large to feel real. Sarah had done her own estimates, but hearing it confirmed by someone who understood the market made it tangible in a way her calculations hadn't. "Can you do it?" she asked. "I can. But it'll take time. A year, maybe 18 months to do it safely. And my percentage goes up, 25% of the net." She'd expected that. 20, 22, and I handle all the risk. If anything goes wrong, you walk away clean. I'm the one holding the stones when the questions come. It was more than fair, given what he was offering. "Deal." They worked out the logistics over the next hour. She would deliver the stones in batches, 50 at a time, unspaced 3 months apart. He would move them through his network, converting them to cash through a series of transactions designed to obscure the origin. She would receive payments quarterly, deposited into accounts he would help her establish, structured to appear as consulting income from a fictitious business entity. It was elaborate, careful, and almost certainly illegal in ways she didn't fully understand. But it was also the only path forward that didn't require trusting the legal system she'd already learned to distrust. Over the following months, Sarah's life transformed in ways that were visible to everyone, but understood by no one. She moved out of the motel and into a modest 2-bedroom apartment in a decent neighborhood. She enrolled Emma in a better school, one with art programs and a library that stayed open after hours. She bought a used car that didn't require constant repairs, and she opened a savings account for Emma's college education, depositing money regularly, building a foundation that wouldn't collapse at the first crisis. To anyone who asked, she explained that she'd gotten a consulting job with a maritime services company, vague but plausible work that justified irregular income without requiring detailed explanation. She filed taxes on the money she deposited, paying what was owed, creating a paper trail that would withstand casual scrutiny, even if it wouldn't survive a forensic audit. The quarterly payments from Marcus arrived like clockwork, each one larger than the last, as he moved through the inventory. By the end of the first year, she had received $900,000. By the end of the second year, the total had climbed past $3 million. The money changed everything and nothing. She still shopped carefully, still counted costs, still felt the phantom weight of poverty in every decision. But Emma had her own room now, filled with books and art supplies. Sarah could afford the asthma medication without choosing between that and groceries. They took a vacation, a real one, to a beach where Emma built sandcastles and laughed in ways Sarah had almost forgotten were possible. And through it all, the secret remained locked inside her, carried alone, never shared. The vindication, when it came, was quieter than she'd imagined. There was no dramatic confrontation, no moment where she stood before those who had mocked her and revealed the truth. Instead, it arrived in small increments, on subtle shifts in how people treated her, now that she appeared stable. Claire reached out 6 months after Sarah had moved into the apartment. The call was awkward at first, both of them navigating the gap that had opened between them. But when Claire visited and saw Emma thriving, saw Sarah paying bills without panic, the criticism that had once flowed so easily dried up. "You really did it," Claire said over coffee in Sarah's small kitchen. "You turned things around." Sarah didn't correct her. She didn't explain that it wasn't determination or hard work that had saved them. It was luck, desperation, and a willingness to cross lines Claire would never understand. "I got lucky," she said instead, which was true in its way. "That ship you bought, the one I thought was such a disaster. Did you ever do anything with it?" "I had it scrapped. Broke even, more or less." Claire shook her head, smiling slightly. "I'm sorry I doubted you. I should have trusted that you knew what you were doing." The apology landed with unexpected weight. Sarah had wanted this, had imagined variations of this conversation during the worst nights in the motel. But now that it was here, she felt no satisfaction. Only a vague sadness that Claire's respect required evidence of stability, that love without success had never been enough. "It's okay," Sarah said, and meant it. "You were just worried." The encounter at the auction house came later, accidental and brief. Sarah had returned to the building for an estate sale, looking for furniture for Emma's room. She walked through the same doors where she'd once sat in desperation, and the auctioneer who had sold her the Meridian was there, preparing for the afternoon's event. He didn't recognize her at first. Then something in her face or posture must have triggered memory, because his expression shifted. "You're the woman who bought that freighter." "I am." "You actually got it removed. Harbor Authority told me. I didn't think you'd pull it off." "Neither did a lot of people." He studied her more carefully now, reassessing. "You made money on it?" "I broke even." It was the same lie she'd told Claire, worn smooth with repetition. He nodded, accepting it without question. "Still, takes guts to buy something like that. Most people who come through here are either professionals or fools. You are hard to categorize. What would you call me now? He smiled, not unkindly. Lucky. She left the building with a small desk she'd purchased, loading it into her car with help from a porter. As she drove away, she thought about luck and what it meant. The people who called her lucky assumed that success came from good fortune, from being in the right place at the right time. They didn't see the nights she'd spent researching, the risks she'd taken, the lines she'd crossed. But they also weren't entirely wrong. She had been lucky. Lucky that the safe existed. Lucky that no one else had found it first. Lucky that Marcus was competent and honest within the bounds of their criminal arrangement. Lucky that Emma had never asked questions Sarah couldn't answer. Luck, she understood now, was just opportunity prepared to meet desperation. And desperation had been her constant companion long before the auction. The final payment from Marcus arrived in the 3rd year, on completing the liquidation of the last batch of diamonds. By then, Sarah had $3.8 million distributed across various accounts, investment funds, and a trust established for Emma's future. It was more money than she'd ever imagined having, yet somehow less transformative than she'd expected. She still worked, having taken a legitimate job as an office manager for a small logistics company. The income was modest, but it provided structure, benefits, and a plausible explanation for her stability. She volunteered at Emma's school, helped with fundraisers, attended parent-teacher conferences where teachers praised her daughter's improvement. From the outside, she looked like any other single mother who'd worked hard and caught a break. No one suspected the truth, because the truth was too improbable to imagine. But late at night, after Emma was asleep and the apartment was quiet, Sarah would sometimes take out the receipt from the auction, the single piece of paper that proved she'd bought a sinking freighter for $700. She'd run her fingers across the printed text, remembering the weight of the decision, the mockery that had followed, the terror and hope that had carried her forward. She had no regrets. That surprised her. She'd expected guilt to corrode her from within, to wake in the night convinced that everything would unravel. Instead, what she felt was a strange peace, born from the certainty that she'd done what was necessary to protect her daughter. The system hadn't saved them. The family who should have helped had instead judged. The society that claimed to value hard work and determination had offered nothing but barriers and bureaucracy. So she'd saved herself, using resources that technically belonged to no one, hidden by people who'd broken other laws decades earlier. She'd become a thief to stop being a victim, and while she knew that distinction wouldn't hold up in court, it held up in her own mind. And that was enough. Emma turned 10 the year Sarah finally paid off the last of the old debts. Medical bills, credit cards, the loans she'd taken out during the marriage, all of it cleared systematically, carefully, without drawing attention. She donated to local charities, funded scholarships at Emma's school, helped families in the neighborhood who reminded her of who she'd been 3 years earlier. The money flowed out almost as steadily as it had come in, and Sarah found that she preferred it that way. Accumulating wealth had never been the goal. Security had been the goal. Freedom from the terror of one bad month destroying everything. She'd achieved that, and in achieving it, she'd learned something she wished she'd known sooner. The distance between survival and stability was far smaller than the distance between poverty and wealth. Crossing that first gap required resources. Crossing the second required nothing she wanted. On the 3rd anniversary of the auction, Sarah took Emma back to the harbor. Not to the industrial basin where the Meridian had rested, but to the public marina on the opposite side, where sailboats bobbed peacefully and families walked along the pier. They bought ice cream and sat on a bench, watching the water. Emma was older now, more aware, so asking questions about the world that Sarah tried to answer honestly within the limits of what a child could understand. "Mom," Emma said at one point, her attention still on the boats. Were we ever really poor? Sarah considered the question carefully. Yes, for a while. But not anymore. Not anymore. What changed? How do you explain to a 10-year-old that everything changed because her mother stole millions of dollars in diamonds from a sunken freighter? How do you convey that desperation had transformed into crime, and crime into security, and security into the life they now lived? I took a risk, Sarah said at last. A big one. It could have gone very wrong. But it didn't. Emma thought about this, her face serious. Was it scary? Very. But you did it anyway. I did it because I had to. Because you needed me to. Emma turned to look at her mother fully, her eyes carrying a weight they shouldn't have at her age. I'm glad you did. Sarah pulled her close, holding her daughter against her side, while the boats drifted past and the water reflected the late afternoon sun. She thought about the auction hall, the mockery, the kayak ride across polluted water, the moment the safe had opened, the weight of decisions that couldn't be unmade. She thought about the ranger in one of those stories she'd read online, the man who'd found a house in the forest that shouldn't exist, who'd uncovered truth that had been deliberately hidden. His story had ended with knowledge preserved, with doing what was right even when it was dangerous. Her story had ended differently. She'd found what was hidden, and she'd taken it. Not to expose wrongdoing or serve justice, but to survive. And maybe that was its own kind of truth. Maybe the world was full of people making impossible choices in impossible circumstances, doing what they had to do with the resources they could find. She didn't know if that made her a hero or a villain or something in between, but she knew Emma was fed and housed and safe. She knew the terror that had defined their lives for so long had finally released its grip. And she knew that whatever judgment history might pass on her choices, she would make the same ones again, without hesitation, for the same reason. Come on, she said, standing and offering Emma her hand. Let's go home. They walked back to the car together, leaving the harbor behind, and Sarah allowed herself one final thought about the freighter that had changed everything. It was gone now, cut apart and recycled, its atoms scattered into new steel that would become buildings and cars and bridges. The diamonds that had rested in its safe for decades were similarly dispersed, transformed into cash, investments, and the quiet stability of a life rebuilt. Nothing remained of the Meridian except memory and a receipt that proved she'd paid $700 for a disaster everyone else had been smart enough to avoid. She'd kept the receipt, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Desperation looked like foolishness until it worked. Risk looked like recklessness until it paid off. And sometimes the difference between poverty and security was nothing more than the willingness to open a door everyone else had walked past, assuming there was nothing worth finding inside. As they drove away from the harbor, Emma humming quietly in the passenger seat, Sarah understood something she'd been too close to see before. The diamonds hadn't saved her. The money, while necessary, hadn't transformed her. What had changed was simpler and more profound. She'd stopped waiting for someone else to rescue her. She'd stopped believing that following the rules would eventually reward her with the stability she deserved. She'd stopped accepting that her daughter's future should be determined by circumstances beyond their control. She'd taken what she needed from a place no one else was looking, and she'd built a life from it. Not a perfect life, not a life without moral complexity, but a life where Emma could dream beyond survival. And if that made her a thief, then she was a thief who slept soundly at night, unknowing that the only thing she'd truly stolen was a future that would have been denied to them otherwise. The sun was setting as they reached their neighborhood, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Sarah parked in front of their apartment building, and Emma ran ahead to greet the neighbor's cat that always waited by the entrance. Sarah followed more slowly, carrying the small desk she'd purchased, thinking about tomorrow and the day after and all the days that would follow. Days without terror, without desperate calculations, without the weight of impossible choices pressing down on her shoulders. She'd bought a sinking ship for $700, and everyone had called her a fool. They'd been wrong, and she'd never tell them why. Epilogue: 5 years after the auction, Sarah received an unexpected letter. It came from a law firm in New York, formal and precisely worded, informing her that the customs case involving the Meridian had been officially closed. All claims against the vessel and its contents had been dropped due to the dissolution of the involved parties and the passage of time beyond the statute of limitations. The letter concluded by noting that since she had been the legal owner of the vessel at the time of its disposal, any contents not explicitly listed in the original seizure documents were considered her property retroactively. It was a bureaucratic formality, a legal closure to a case that had been forgotten by everyone except the lawyers paid to finalize paperwork. Sarah read the letter 3 times, understanding its implications. If anyone ever questioned the diamond's provenance, she now had documentation suggesting legitimate ownership. The universe, it seemed, had a sense of irony. She filed the letter carefully, adding it to the small collection of documents she kept in a fireproof safe in her closet. The auction receipt, the harbor authorities' removal confirmation, Tommy's disposal records, and now this, an official acknowledgement from the legal system that had once threatened to take everything from her. She never told Emma the full truth. Perhaps she would someday, when her daughter was old enough to understand the complexity of choices made under duress. Or perhaps she'd take the secret with her, letting Emma believe what everyone else believed, that her mother had been lucky, resourceful, determined. It didn't matter. What mattered was that Emma graduated high school with honors, and that she was accepted to her first-choice college with a full scholarship from the foundation Sarah had quietly established, that she grew into adulthood never knowing what it meant to choose between medication and food, between rent and utilities, between survival and dignity. The freighter had given Sarah that gift, and she'd accepted it with full knowledge of what it cost. Some prices, she'd learned, were worth paying, even if you paid them alone, in silence, forever. 3 months after she'd begun selling the diamonds, Sarah returned to Eddie's pawnshop with another stone. She'd avoided going back, remembering his warning about not bringing heat to his establishment. But the other shops had started asking more questions, and Eddie's indifference had been a kind of safety she couldn't find elsewhere. He was alone when she entered, working on something behind the counter with a jeweler's glass. He looked up, recognized her, and his expression shifted into something between annoyance and concern. "Thought I told you to use the contact I gave you," he said, setting down his tools. "I did. I'm just here to thank you." He studied her for a long moment. "You moved a lot through Marcus, didn't you?" She didn't answer. The silence stretched between them, heavy with implication. Eddie leaned forward, his voice dropping. "You know what your mistake is? You look different now. You came in here 3 months ago looking like someone who'd been beaten down by the world. Now you walk in here with new clothes, better posture, like someone who's figured something out. People notice that kind of change. I got a job." "Sure you did." He pulled out a business card from beneath the counter and slid it across to her. "That's a financial advisor. A real one, not some strip mall tax preparer. You're going to need someone who understands how to make money look legitimate, how to pay taxes on it without explaining where it came from." Sarah picked up the card. "Why are you helping me?" "Because I've seen people like you before, people who stumble into something they weren't prepared for. Most of them make stupid mistakes. They buy cars they can't afford, take trips they can't explain, flash cash in places they shouldn't. Then they disappear. I don't know what you found, and I don't want to know. But whatever it is, it's big enough that you need to be smarter than you think you need to be. She pocketed the card. Thank you. Don't thank me. Just don't come back here. We're done. She left the shop understanding that Eddie had just given her something more valuable than the contact with Marcus. He'd given her perspective, a reminder that every choice she made was visible to someone, and visibility was the enemy of secrets. The school conference. The parent-teacher conference happened during the second year, when Emma was 9, and Sarah was still learning to navigate the careful performance of normalcy. She sat in a small classroom across from Mrs. Patterson, Emma's teacher, listening to praise she'd once believed she'd never hear. Emma's doing remarkably well, Mrs. Patterson said, her smile genuine. Her reading comprehension has improved dramatically. She's participating more in class discussions. And her artwork, she gestured to a painting pinned to the wall, a vibrant landscape in blues and greens, shows real talent. Sarah looked at the painting and felt something crack inside her chest. Emma had painted a house by the water, not the freighter, nothing that specific, but the echo was there in the way the structure sat against the blue background, solitary and strange. She seems happier, Mrs. Patterson continued, more settled. I know you've been through some transitions as a family. Whatever you're doing, it's working. We moved to a better place, Sarah said, which was true. More stable. It shows. Emma mentioned you're helping with the art program fundraiser. We really appreciate parent involvement. They discussed the fundraiser, the upcoming field trip, Emma's social development. Normal things, the kind of conversation Sarah had watched other mothers have for years, while she stood on the outside, too exhausted and too poor to participate fully. When the conference ended, Mrs. Patterson walked her to the door. I have to say, Ms. Mitchell, Emma's transformation has been one of the most rewarding things I've seen in my years of teaching. Sometimes all a child needs is stability, and somehow you've managed to provide that. I don't know how you did it, but you should be proud. Sarah thanked her and walked to her car, that praise following her like a weight. Mrs. Patterson thought she'd done something admirable, something that proved the value of hard work and determination. She didn't know that Emma's stability had been purchased with stolen diamonds, that the art supplies and the new backpack and the field trip permission slip Sarah could now afford to sign had all been funded by a crime Sarah committed in desperation. The pride Mrs. Patterson wanted her to feel was contaminated by the knowledge of how it had been achieved. And yet, when she picked Emma up from her after-school program and saw her daughter's face light up, Sarah couldn't bring herself to regret it. Some lies, she thought, were worth living inside forever if they protected the people you loved. The close call. The moment that nearly destroyed everything came during the fourth quarter of the second year. Sarah had just received another payment from Marcus on $75,000 deposited across 3 accounts as payment for the latest batch of diamonds. She'd been careful, as always, staying below reporting thresholds, spacing deposits across multiple institutions. But someone had noticed. The letter arrived from the IRS, polite and bureaucratic, requesting additional documentation regarding her reported income for the previous tax year. They wanted to verify her consulting business, to see contracts, invoices, proof of services rendered. Sarah sat in her apartment, the letter shaking in her hands, understanding that this was how it would end. Not with police raids or dramatic arrests, but with an audit, questions she couldn't answer, a paper trail that would unravel under even moderate scrutiny. She called the financial advisor Eddie had recommended, a woman named Janet, who worked from a small office downtown and specialized in what she carefully described as complex income situations. Janet reviewed Sarah's records with the detached professionalism of someone who'd seen worse. The problem, she said after an hour, is that you've created a business entity, but you haven't actually operated like a business. No client invoices, no contracts, no business expenses beyond the bare minimum. To the IRS, this looks like money laundering. What do I do? You retroactively create a paper trail. I have templates for service contracts. We'll backdate them, create fictional clients who paid you for maritime consulting services. We'll generate invoices that match your deposit patterns. It's not perfect, but it's enough to satisfy a routine audit. Is that legal? Janet looked at her over her reading glasses. Is any of this legal, Ms. Mitchell? Sarah understood then that Janet knew, not the specifics, but enough to recognize the shape of the situation. How much will this cost? $10,000 for the documentation and representation if they pursue the audit further. But I need to be clear about something. This will work once, maybe twice if we're lucky. But if you keep generating income at this rate without legitimate business activity to support it, eventually, someone's going to dig deeper than I can protect you from. Sarah paid the $10,000, and Janet worked what felt like magic, creating a business history that looked plausible on paper. The IRS accepted the documentation after a 3-month review, and the audit was closed with no penalties assessed. But the experience had shaken Sarah in ways the original theft hadn't. She'd been so focused on the mechanics of converting diamonds to cash that she hadn't fully considered the secondary systems designed to catch exactly what she was doing. She'd been lucky again, saved by Eddie's foresight in giving her Janet's contact information. She reduced her pace after that, asking Marcus to slow the liquidation, accepting that converting $4 million in stolen diamonds would take years, not months. Better to be patient than to be caught. Better to be safe than to lose Emma to a mistake that could have been avoided. The unexpected kindness. During the 3rd year, Sarah encountered someone from her past in the grocery store. Linda Chen had worked at the same accounting firm where Sarah had been employed before the divorce, before the financial collapse. They'd been friendly colleagues, lunch companions occasionally, but nothing deeper. Linda recognized her immediately. Sarah? Sarah Mitchell? There was no avoiding the conversation. Sarah turned, forcing a smile. Linda. Hi. They stood in the produce section making awkward small talk until Linda asked the question Sarah had been dreading. How have you been? I heard things got difficult after you left the firm. They did for a while, but things are better now. Linda studied her, and Sarah saw the calculation happening behind her eyes. The old Sarah had been worn down, perpetually exhausted, dressed in clothes that showed their age. This Sarah looked rested, put together, stable. I'm glad, Linda said, and something in her tone suggested she meant it. I always felt bad about what happened. The way they let you go, it wasn't fair. You were dealing with so much, and they should have been more understanding. The kindness surprised Sarah. She'd expected judgment, the same subtle condescension she'd received from Claire. Instead, Linda seemed genuinely happy to see her doing better. Thank you, Sarah said. That means a lot. They exchanged phone numbers, and Linda insisted they get coffee sometime. Sarah agreed, expecting it to be one of those empty promises people make when they run into old acquaintances. But a week later, Linda called and suggested lunch. They met at a quiet restaurant, and over salads, Linda asked careful questions about Emma, about where Sarah was working now, about how she'd managed to turn things around, and Sarah delivered her rehearsed answers, the consulting business story she'd built with Janet's help. But Linda seemed less interested in the specifics than in the fact of Sarah's recovery. You should be proud of yourself, Linda said. A lot of people in your situation would have given up. You didn't. Sarah wanted to tell her the truth, wanted to explain that she hadn't pulled herself up through determination and hard work, that she'd stumbled into a solution that had nothing to do with virtue and everything to do with desperation meeting opportunity. But the truth would destroy the moment, would turn Linda's kindness into horror or judgment, or worse, pity. So she accepted the praise she didn't deserve and carried the weight of that deception as she'd learned to carry all the others. When they parted, Linda hugged her. Let's not lose touch again. I mean it. Sarah promised they wouldn't, and she meant it too in a way, because Linda's friendship had reminded her of something she'd almost forgotten, that before the poverty, before the desperation, before the diamonds, she'd been a person people liked, someone who belonged in normal conversations, in ordinary restaurants, in a life that didn't require constant performance and careful lies. The money had bought her stability, but it was moments like this, unexpected kindness from people who remembered who she'd been, that made her feel almost human again. Emma's question. The question came on a Saturday morning during the 4th year, while they were making pancakes together. Emma was 12 now, old enough to notice inconsistencies, young enough to ask about them directly. "Mom, where did Grandma's consulting business come from?" Sarah's hand stilled over the mixing bowl. "What do you mean?" "You always say you do maritime consulting, but you never talk about your clients. And you're home a lot. Most people who do consulting are always busy, always on calls. You're just here." It was the first time Emma had questioned the story directly, and Sarah felt her heart rate accelerate. She'd prepared for this conversation theoretically, but theory couldn't account for looking into her daughter's eyes and deciding how much truth to offer. "I work with a few long-term clients," Sarah said carefully. "The projects are spread out, so I have more flexibility than some consultants." "What kind of projects?" "Ship disposal, salvage assessment, that kind of thing." Emma considered this while pouring batter onto the griddle. "Is that what you did with that ship you bought? The one Aunt Claire said was a waste of money?" "Something like that." "Did you make money from it?" Sarah flipped a pancake, watching it brown. "I made enough to get us here, to this apartment, this life. But not from consulting." It wasn't a question. Emma had somehow intuited the truth, or at least glimpsed its outline. Sarah could lie, could reinforce the story she'd been telling for years. Or she could offer something closer to honesty, without revealing the parts that would frighten her daughter. "The ship was an investment," Sarah said slowly. "A risky one that most people thought was foolish. But it paid off in ways I didn't expect. The consulting business came later, a way to build on what I learned." "You don't like talking about it?" "No." "Because it was hard?" "Because it was complicated." Sarah plated the pancakes and sat across from Emma at their small kitchen table. "Sometimes the things that save us aren't the things we're proud of. They're just the things that were available when we needed them most." Emma cut into her pancake thoughtfully. "Are we safe now? Like, really safe?" "Yes." "Promise?" Sarah reached across the table and took her daughter's hand. "I promise. Whatever I had to do to get us here, it's done. And we're safe." Emma nodded, accepting this, and the conversation moved to other topics, lighter things, plans for the weekend. But Sarah understood that a threshold had been crossed. Emma was old enough now to sense the gaps in the story, even if she didn't yet know how to articulate what was missing. Someday, Sarah thought, she might have to tell her daughter the whole truth, but not today. Not while Emma was still young enough to believe that her mother's sacrifices had been noble rather than necessary, that the life they'd built together had come from courage rather than crime. The pancakes tasted fine, but Sarah barely noticed. She was too busy calculating how many more years she had before Emma started asking questions she couldn't deflect, before the truth became unavoidable. She hoped it would be enough time to figure out how to explain that sometimes love looked like theft, that sometimes Protecting your child meant becoming someone you'd never planned to be. But for now, on this Saturday morning with sunlight streaming through the kitchen window and her daughter eating pancakes across from her, Sarah allowed herself to pretend that the story she'd been telling was true. It was easier that way. For both of them. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.